In 1936, the most powerful entertainer on the face of the earth was 8 years old. She woke up every morning at 5. A woman, not her mother, not a friend, but an employee of a film studio, would sit her down in front of a mirror and begin counting. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 56. 56 perfect pin curls, wound tight, set with precision because the contract demanded it, because the audience demanded it. Because an 8-year-old girl had become the single most valuable commercial asset in the history of Hollywood. And assets do not get to have bad hair days. And she could not spend a single dollar without her parents' permission. We talk about the golden age of Hollywood like it was a fairy tale. The gowns, the lights, the dream. But every fairy tale has a price written in the fine print, and nobody reads the fine print to a 3-year-old. This is not the story of a child star who had it all. This is the story of a little girl who was it all, for everyone except herself. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. Gertrude Temple was not a monster. That is the most important thing to understand before this story goes any further. She was a woman who grew up in the early 1900s in a world that offered women like her exactly 2 options: disappear quietly into domesticity or fight for something more. Gertrude had a gift for music. She had a hunger for the stage, and then life, as it tends to do, closed that door before she ever got the chance to walk through it. She married a banker named George Temple. She moved to Santa Monica. She became a housewife. But the hunger did not go away. It never does. On April the 23rd, in 1928, Gertrude gave birth to her 3rd child. A girl with bright eyes and an instinct for rhythm that seemed almost impossible for someone so small. From the very first months of Shirley's life, Gertrude began to see something. Not just a daughter, a second chance. She started curling Shirley's hair before the girl could walk steadily on her own. 56 pin curls, set every single morning with the kind of obsessive precision that most people reserve for surgical procedures. When neighbors asked why she bothered with such an elaborate routine for a toddler, Gertrude would smile and say she simply wanted her daughter to look her best. But there was nothing simple about it. Every curl was an act of preparation. Every curl was a small, deliberate step toward a destination Shirley had not yet been told about. In 1931, Gertrude enrolled 3-year-old Shirley in Meglin's dance school in Los Angeles. She told her daughter it was going to be fun. And perhaps for a while it was. Shirley took to dancing the way most children take to breathing, naturally, effortlessly, with a joy that looked completely unforced because at 3 years old it still was. It was at Meglin's that a casting director from Educational Pictures first laid eyes on her. He did not see a child. He saw a product with extraordinary market potential. Within weeks, Shirley Temple had her first contract. She was 3 years old. Nobody asked her whether she wanted it. What followed was a series of short films called Baby Burlesques, produced between 1932 and 1933. The premise was simple and deeply uncomfortable in hindsight. Very small children were dressed in miniature versions of adult costumes and directed to imitate grown-up situations, political figures, and Hollywood scandals of the day. The studio marketed it as wholesome comedy. The audience laughed. Nobody looked too closely at what they were actually watching. On set, discipline was maintained through a method that Shirley would only describe publicly decades later in her own autobiography. When a child misbehaved or refused to perform, they were placed inside what the crew called the black box. It was a dark enclosed space with a block of ice for a seat. Children sat inside it alone until they were ready to cooperate. Shirley Temple was placed in the black box more than once. She was 4 years old. There is a particular kind of lesson that gets learned in a place like that. Not the lesson the adults intended. Children do not learn obedience in the dark. They learn concealment. They learn that their feelings are inconvenient. They learn to perform compliance while keeping whatever is real buried somewhere the cameras cannot reach. It is a lesson Shirley Temple would carry for the rest of her life, long after the cameras stopped rolling. By 1933, the Baby Burlesque series had run its course, but Shirley had already been noticed by someone far more significant than Educational Pictures. A talent agent spotted her dancing in the lobby of a hotel and immediately moved to sign her with Fox Film Corporation. Gertrude agreed without hesitation. The contract was structured in a way that would become a defining feature of Shirley's entire childhood. Fox did not just hire Shirley, Fox hired the family. Gertrude was placed on the studio payroll as Shirley's personal hairdresser and coach. It was presented as a privilege, a loving arrangement that allowed a mother to stay close to her child. What it actually did was ensure that Gertrude's financial interests were now permanently aligned with the studio's interests, not with her daughter's. The person who was supposed to protect Shirley from the machine had been quietly absorbed into the machine. And Shirley, 5 years old and still believing that all of this was a game she was very good at, walked through the gates of Fox Film Corporation and into a world that had been waiting for her. A world that already knew exactly what it intended to do with her. But what was about to happen over the next 12 months would stun an entire country. Because in 1934, in the middle of the worst economic collapse America had ever seen, a little girl with 56 curls and a smile she had been practicing since before she could read, was about to become the most famous human being on the planet. And the price of that fame had already been paid. She just did not know it yet. In 1934, America was broken. 1 in 4 workers had no job. Families stood in bread lines stretching around city blocks. Men who had once owned businesses sold apples on street corners for a nickel apiece. The country was not just economically devastated, it was spiritually exhausting. People had stopped believing that things could get better, and that kind of despair is harder to recover from than poverty alone. And then Shirley Temple appeared on screen. She was 5 years old, and she moved like sunlight. She tapped her feet with the confidence of someone who had never once been told the world was a frightening place. She sang in a voice so clear it seemed to cut straight through the gray fog that had settled over an entire nation. When she smiled, and she always smiled, audiences felt something they had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope, not the political kind, not the kind that requires a speech or a policy. The simple, irrational, overwhelming kind that a child's laughter produces in the chest of someone who desperately needs to hear it. Fox Film Corporation understood exactly what they had. Her breakthrough came in May 1934 with Stand Up and Cheer, a musical that featured a brief but explosive performance from Shirley that stopped audiences cold. Studio executives watched the reaction in theaters and made a decision the same week. This child was not a supporting player. This child was a franchise. Within months, she had been cast in Little Miss Marker, Baby Take-a-Bow, and Now and Forever. By the end of 1934, she had appeared in 10 films in 12 months, while being 5 years old. The pace was not accidental. Fox was not being careless. Fox was being deliberate. They had discovered a resource, and they intended to extract it as efficiently as possible before the conditions changed. Then came Bright Eyes in December 1934, the film written specifically and entirely for her. It was the first time a major Hollywood studio had built a production from the ground up around a child performer. The film gave the world on the good ship Lollipop, a song so perfectly engineered for Shirley's voice and persona that it became inseparable from her identity for the rest of her life and long after her death. In February 1935, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded Shirley Temple a special Juvenile Academy Award for her outstanding contribution to cinema during 1934. She was 6 years old. She received a full-sized Oscar statuette and a miniature one because nobody was quite sure if she could lift the regular one unassisted. The audience laughed. It was adorable. It was also the moment the entire industry collectively decided that Shirley Temple existed in a category separate from other human beings, one where the normal rules of labor, childhood, and personal autonomy simply did not apply. By 1935, her salary had climbed to $2,500 a week. By the end of that year, it would rise further still. She was the #1 box office star in America, a title she would hold for 4 consecutive years. The merchandising empire surrounding her image generated millions annually. Shirley Temple dolls filled the shelves of department stores across the country. Her face appeared on soap, cereal boxes, sheet music, and children's clothing. Her image was everywhere. She was not consulted about any of it. Fox had constructed something extraordinary around her. A world that looked from the outside like the most privileged childhood imaginable. The private bungalow in the studio lot with 5 rooms and its own kitchen. The personal tutor who provided exactly 3 hours of school instruction per day. The legal minimum. The carefully curated group of child visitors occasionally brought to the set so that photographs could be taken of Shirley playing with other children. Images that would be released to fan magazines as evidence of her normal, happy life. None of it was accidental. All of it was architecture. The studio understood something that Gertrude either did not see or chose not to see. The more separate Shirley was kept from ordinary childhood experience, the more completely her identity could be controlled. A child who never played freely with other children, never learned to define herself through those relationships. A child whose every public appearance was staged, never developed the instinct to distinguish between performance and reality. The bungalow was not a gift. It was a very comfortable form of isolation. And through all of it, Shirley Temple smiled. Because smiling was what she knew. Because smiling was what they needed. Because somewhere between the black box on the baby burlesque set and the gold statuette pressed into her small hands at the Biltmore Hotel, she had learned the lesson completely. Her feelings were not the point. The performance was the point. But time, which had been so generous to Shirley Temple in these golden years, was already making other plans. Because the one thing no studio contract in the history of Hollywood had ever successfully negotiated was this: children grow up. And the moment Shirley Temple began to grow up, everything was going to change. In 1940, Shirley Temple was 12 years old. She was still under contract, still showing up at 5 in the morning, still sitting in the chair while a woman counted 56 curls. But something had shifted in the air around her, something she could feel before she could name it. The way studio executives looked at her had changed, not with cruelty, not yet, but with a particular kind of clinical disappointment, the way a farmer looks at a season that is ending too soon. The problem in the eyes of Fox Film Corporation was simple and unsolvable. Shirley Temple was growing up. Her face was losing the soft roundness of early childhood. Her voice was deepened by fractions. The body that had been so perfectly suited to the image of an eternal, unthreatening, endlessly cheerful little girl was doing what bodies do, quietly and without permission, becoming something else, something the audience had not signed up for. The Bluebird, released in 1940, was meant to be her grand artistic statement, a lavish fantasy film with a significant budget and serious creative ambitions. Instead, it became the first film in Shirley Temple's career to lose money at the box office. The audience stayed away. Critics were polite but distant. The trade papers noted the underperformance with the kind of detached precision that the industry reserved for equipment failures and weather delays. Nobody at Fox asked what the film meant to Shirley. Nobody asked how it felt to watch your first failure play out on the front pages of trade publications at the age of 12. The only question Fox was asking internally was the same question they always asked. How do we protect the asset? The answer they arrived at was one of the most quietly devastating decisions in Hollywood history. Rather than allowing Shirley to evolve as a performer, rather than investing in the development of a more mature screen persona, Fox simply declined to renew her contract. In 1940, after 6 years and an incalculable contribution to the studio's financial survival during the hardest economic decade in American history, Shirley Temple was let go. There was no formal farewell, no acknowledgement of what she had given them. A contract expired, and Fox chose not to extend it. That was all. She was 12 years old. She moved to MGM and then to independent productions, and she kept working through her teenage years with the particular determination of someone who had been taught since the age of 3 that stopping was not an option. She appeared in Since You Went Away in 1944 and received genuine critical praise for a performance that showed real emotional depth. She starred opposite Cary Grant in The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer in 1947 and held her own against one of the most effortlessly charming actors in the history of the medium. But the audience would not follow her. This is the part of the story that requires a moment of uncomfortable honesty about the nature of fame and what audiences actually love when they believe they love a person. The millions of Americans who had filled theaters throughout the 1930s to watch Shirley Temple had not fallen in love with her talent, though the talent was real. They had fallen in love with the feeling she produced, the warmth, the safety, the uncomplicated joy of watching a small child navigate a difficult world and always come out smiling. That feeling was not transferable to a teenager. It could not survive adolescence. And when audiences encountered a 17-year-old Shirley Temple on screen, what they felt was not affection, but a vague, unexamined sense of loss, as though something had been taken from them. The something that had been taken was, of course, the illusion. Shirley Temple recalled walking into studio casting offices as a teenager and watching the expression on executives' faces shift the moment she entered the room. They were expecting on some irrational level the 6-year-old. What they saw instead was a young woman, and they could not reconcile the two. The auditions would proceed with a kind of performative enthusiasm that fooled no one, least of all Shirley. She understood what was happening. She had been trained since infancy to read a room. She was being discarded. And then there was the money. When Shirley Temple finally reached adulthood and gained legal access to her own financial records, what she found was not the fortune that should have been waiting for her. The exact figures have never been fully disclosed, but the picture that emerged was deeply painful. Years of earnings that had passed through her parents' hands, and the studio's accounting systems had been substantially depleted. Poor investments, excessive spending, management decisions made by people whose interests were not aligned with hers. The Coogan Law, passed in California in 1939 specifically to protect child performers, after a similar situation, destroyed child star Jackie Coogan financially, had been riddled with loopholes that made it largely ineffective. Shirley Temple had generated somewhere in the range of $3 million during the peak years of her career, an almost incomprehensible sum for the 1930s. What remained by the time she was old enough to ask questions was a fraction of that. She did not rage publicly. She did not give interviews full of accusation and bitterness. She had been trained too well for that. She understood with the particular clarity of someone who had spent a childhood learning to keep difficult feelings off her face, that public anger would cost her more than silence. So, she was silent, and the silence itself tells the entire story. In 1945, at 17, she married actor John Agar. It was a union that the press celebrated with the predictable enthusiasm of an industry that had been narrating Shirley Temple's life as a fairy tale for over a decade. The wedding photographs were beautiful. The coverage was rapturous. A fairy tale ending for America's most beloved child. What the coverage did not examine, because fairy tales do not examine such things, was what it meant that a 17-year-old girl with no real experience of private life, no template for ordinary relationships, no sense of self that existed outside of performance and public consumption, was walking into a marriage. Shirley had never had the chance to become a person before she was expected to become a wife. The marriage lasted 4 years. Agar developed serious problems with alcohol. There were episodes of instability that Shirley would only allude to in later years, never fully describing, maintaining to the end the careful discretion she had practiced since childhood. A daughter, Linda Susan, was born, and then the marriage ended in 1949, quietly and with the minimum of public drama that Shirley always managed to engineer around the painful events of her life. In 1950, she retired from film at the age of 22, not because she had failed, but because she had finally, for the first time in her life, chosen something for herself, even if what she was choosing was simply to stop. The lights went down, the cameras stopped rolling. And somewhere in that silence was a woman who had been performing continuously since the age of 3. Finally standing in a room with no audience, no director, no mother, counting curls, trying to hear for the first time what her own voice sounded like when nobody was asking anything of it. She was not sure yet what she would find, but she was finally the one asking the question. In 1950, Shirley Temple Black closed the door in Hollywood and did not look back. She had married Charles Alden Black, a naval officer and businessman from San Francisco the year before. The decision to add his name to hers was not a formality. It was a declaration. She was no longer simply Shirley Temple, the product, the property, the porcelain doll with 56 curls that a nation had projected its dreams onto for the better part of a decade. She was Shirley Temple Black now, a different person. Or, perhaps more accurately, the person she had always been underneath, finally being allowed to surface. With Charles, she built something she had never had, a private life, a home where cameras were not welcome. 3 children who were raised with the kind of deliberate, protected normalcy that their mother understood. From the most personal possible experience was not a given, but a gift requiring active defense. She attended their school events without publicists. She made ordinary decisions about ordinary days. She learned, slowly and imperfectly, what it felt like to exist without an audience. It was harder than it sounds. When the performance has been the architecture of your entire existence since the age of 3, the absence of it does not feel like freedom at first. It feels like silence in a room where there used to be music. Shirley Temple Black would later speak about this period with characteristic restraint, but the shape of what she described was clear enough. She was rebuilding from the foundation, learning to distinguish between what she actually thought and felt and wanted, and what she had been conditioned to think and feel and want for the consumption of others. Then in 1972, she received a diagnosis that would have destroyed the composure of almost anyone: breast cancer. At the time, the subject was so deeply taboo in American public life that most women who received such a diagnosis processed it in complete isolation, too ashamed or too frightened of social consequence to speak about it openly, even with close friends. The cultural silence around the disease was itself a form of violence, one that delayed diagnoses and cost lives with quiet efficiency for decades. Shirley Temple Black held a press conference from her hospital room. She described her diagnosis, her surgery, and her prognosis with the direct and unadorned clarity of someone who had decided that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of exposure. She was not performing bravery. She was making a calculated decision that her platform, the one thing her childhood had given her that she could actually use on her own terms, was worth something in this moment. The response was immediate and significant. Women across the country called their doctors. Others who had been quietly carrying the same diagnosis came forward. Medical professionals noted a measurable increase in women seeking screening in the months that followed. The cultural conversation around breast cancer in America shifted, not entirely and not overnight, but it shifted. And the person who moved it was a woman sitting in a hospital room deciding that this time she would not keep her feelings off her face. It was, without question, the most important performance of her life. And it was the one she chose entirely for herself. Her diplomatic career ran alongside and after this moment with a quiet distinction that surprised everyone who had only ever thought of her as a child with curls. United States Ambassador to Ghana from 1974 to 1976. Chief of Protocol of the United States under President Gerald Ford, the first woman ever to hold that position. United States Ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1989 to 1992. Honorary United States Foreign Service Officer in 1988. The first person in history to receive that designation. She served under 4 presidents. She negotiated with foreign governments. She represented her country in rooms where the stakes were real and the consequences of failure were not measured in box office receipts. The woman who had been denied agency over her own curls was now shaping the foreign policy of the most powerful nation on earth, and yet the Kennedy Center honored her in 1998. The Screen Actors Guild gave her a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2005. Every tribute, every retrospective, every fond remembrance that followed her death on February 10th, 2014, inevitably reached back to the same images. The curls, the smile, the tap shoes. The little girl on the good ship Lollipop sailing away into a sea of Depression-era longing. The world never fully let go of the doll, which is perhaps the most bittersweet truth of all. Shirley Temple Black spent the second half of her life building a self that was genuinely her own, brick by careful brick, and she succeeded in ways that most people never approach. But the image the world chose to remember, the image that will outlast every diplomatic cable she ever signed and every life her courage may have saved, is the image that was built for her before she was old enough to consent to it. She won. She genuinely won. But some things once taken cannot be fully returned. There is a photograph taken of Shirley Temple Black sometime in the 1980s. She is in her 50s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, standing in a room that looks like it belongs to someone who has earned their place in it. Her posture is straight, her expression is calm, and she is smiling. Not the smile from the films, not the 56 curl smile that was wound tight every morning by someone else's hands for someone else's purposes. This one is different, quieter. It belongs to her. I think about that photograph whenever I think about what it costs to become yourself after the world has already decided who you are. Shirley Temple was handed to an industry before she had a name for her own feelings. She was shaped, packaged, sold, and eventually discarded by a machine that had no interest in who she actually was. And then, in the long second half of a life that most people overlook entirely, she did something that required more courage than any tap routine ever could. She started over. She built something real. She used the only platform she had been given to do something genuinely good in the world, and she did it on her own terms. That is not a simple, happy ending. The money that was taken from her was never fully restored. The childhood that was spent on those film sets was never replaced. The girl who sat in the dark box at 4 years old and learned to bury her feelings so deeply that even she could not always find them. That girl deserved better. Full stop. But the woman she became chose to make something of what remained. And that choice, made without cameras and without applause, is the truest thing about her. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what you are thinking. And if you want to keep going deeper into the lives that Hollywood built and broke, subscribe and stay close. There's so much more to tell. More.